welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I am Allison Gampel, and I work as the Associate Director of Alumni Programs at York University. Happy Pride Month. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture, Pandemic Possibilities, Sexuality, Gender, and Youth in the Time of COVID, with Dr. Jen Gilbert, who's a professor in the Faculty of Education. Before we begin, I accept the responsibility to acknowledge the land that I'm on. Because we're not all gathered in the same place, the land that I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory that you're on. So please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you're on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. In light of today's discussion, I'd also like to acknowledge Two-Spirit people, the disruption of Two-Spirit teachings that was made, and the ongoing impact of colonization. In creating the term Two-Spirit, the founding group wanted to reflect the historical acceptance of gender variant peoples and the diverse sexual identities within Indigenous communities. Before we introduce our speaker today, I'm excited to tell you that York is strengthening its position as a leader in creating a sustainable and inclusive world. We've recently placed in the top 35 post-secondary institutions in the respected Times Higher Education Impact Rankings. This month, we have many activities, talks, and programs acknowledging and celebrating Pride Month. Visit yorku.ca/YU Pride for a complete listing. We're also actively building a 2S LGBTQ+ alumni network, and we are looking for members and volunteers. If you're interested in learning more, please connect with me directly at alumni@yorku.ca. To find out everything else happening at York, you know that you can always read our monthly newsletter, the York U Alumni News, which should be arriving in your inbox today. If you don't receive it, please feel free to update your contact information on our website and make sure that you're subscribed. Our website is yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Now, before we begin our lecture today, we always like to get to know our audience. So a poll question is about to pop up. And the question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? So it's popped up on your screen, and I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Thank you very much. It's always helpful for our speaker to know who's in our audience and how much they know about the topic. Good. Looks like we have a lot to learn, which is just wonderful. We're all pretty familiar with Zoom after a couple years, but if you need any help at all, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. We have a team that's ready to help you. And that same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speaker, who will answer them during our Q&A period that will follow the presentation. Please do note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and our staff, so please keep your comments relevant and respectful. Okay, so on to what we came for. Today's talk will be given by Dr. Jen Gilbert, who's a professor in the Faculty of Education. Dr. Gilbert is the author of Sexuality in School, The Limits of Education. Dr. Gilbert's research explores the experiences of LGBTQ+ students, teachers, and families in school, as well as controversies around sexuality education. We are so pleased that Dr. Gilbert could make time to join us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you well. So
awesome. Okay.
I'm going to pop off camera and let you present, and I'll be back after to take some questions.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks everyone here and in the world out there. I'm Jen Gilbert, and I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides. I'm really excited to talk to you today about a research project that I completed last year. And this paper comes out of that research project. I worked on this project and this paper in particular also with Dr. David Pereira, a postdoc at York, who's now at U of T, and a PhD student, Thomas Frateroli, who also has helped with this paper. So many thanks to David and Thomas for their help. I'm going to jump right in, and I'm looking forward to our conversations. And if you have any questions, I feel really excited to hear them and would be happy to answer them. So I'll talk for about, I don't know, 15, maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll have a time for a conversation. So just to begin, I want to ask this. We did this project, and here's my questions. Are there specific gender identities or sexualities that belong to the pandemic? How will the experience of living with and through COVID-19 shape young people's sense of their bodies, genders, desires, sexualities? How will those stay-at-home orders, virtual schooling, canceled proms, viral TikTok dances, the boredom, the omnipresent doom, how will all of these things inspire or perhaps constrain new sexual and gender formations? To be clear, these were not our questions when we began collecting stories of sexuality and gender from Toronto students and teachers in 2 high schools in May 2021. We had planned to build a booth for pre-pandemic times. And here you can see a picture of the storytelling booth that we've used in the past when we've done this project. We thought we'd build this big wooden booth in each school's corridor, greet students as they arrived each morning, and offer them granola bars, an invitation to step inside this booth and to share a story, any story, of LGBTQ+ sexuality or gender. With these stories and the interviews we also plan to conduct, we hope to learn how stories of sexuality and gender circulate through the school, beneath and perhaps adjacent to the official story of LGBTQ inclusivity, including anti-bullying and harassment efforts. But as you know, COVID happened and Toronto entered a long lockdown that kept students in their homes and out of face-to-face school for almost 18 months. The experience of being a student in high school changed dramatically, and so did research. This presentation today chronicles our efforts to host a school-based storytelling project online during a pandemic that had both expected and surprising effects on young people's understanding of their own and others' sexual and gender identities. So when we began to collect online stories about LGBTQ sexuality and gender from youth, we really expected to hear a lot of stories of waning mental health, struggles with family, boredom, and loneliness. You know, this was really the story in the news, how much young people were suffering during the pandemic, and in particular, how much LGBTQ+ youth were suffering during the pandemic. We were working at the time with 2 Toronto high schools after more than a year of mostly virtual school. At the time of our research last May 2021, you will know, most of you, Toronto was under yet another strict stay-at-home order, and vaccinations were just starting to reach the general public. Social media, news outlets, and public conversations all seemed to emphasize the ways teens were struggling under quarantine. Now, we did hear those stories. We did hear stories of boredom and struggle. However, a surprising number of students also described how life in quarantine had offered them emotional and physical space to examine their friendships, explore their sexual and gender identities outside what some participants called the toxic atmosphere of high school. And today I want to share some of these stories and consider what the pandemic might have quite accidentally taught us about youth's experiences of sexuality and gender. So you can see here from my slide, Beyond Bullying at the top, that's the name of our research project that we've been working on now for a number of years. The Beyond Bullying project is an ethnographic school-based storytelling project that invites teachers, students, staff to share stories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer sexuality and gender in a private booth. Yet, when COVID interrupted our plans to enter those high schools, we worked with a website designer to create a storytelling portal on our website. And this is sort of a screenshot of our website. The storytelling portal on the website sort of became our substitute for that booth. We shared the link with the school communities through our social media accounts, with clubs and councils that were running online in schools, in teachers' meetings, through the school's own information sharing networks, and through word of mouth. And then once students kind of got to this front page here and clicked on a link, they entered into this section, which was they would complete a demographic survey, an online consent form, and then they would be emailed a unique private Zoom link that they could use at any time to tell a story. So that link would stay active during the entirety of our project, about 3 weeks or so, and they could come back and use that link to tell multiple stories. Every time a student told a story, they would be entered into a draw to win a pair of Bluetooth AirPods like these. Over the course of 3 weeks, we collected about 56 stories in both schools. Here's some stats on the stories we collected during those 2 weeks last year, 2 to 3 weeks. Just to say that our idea around this storytelling is that when it was the big wooden booth, but also with this virtual booth, was that we would just say to students, come and tell a story. It can be about anything. It could be about your friends. It could be about family. It could be about your favorite TV show or celebrity. It doesn't even have to be true. We had this sense that we wanted to get those stories that don't make it into sort of like the official narrative of what it means to be gay in schools or queer in schools. We wanted to have a sense of like, what are the other quieter stories that are circulating through the schools? And storytelling, especially this uninterrupted sort of self-directed storytelling from participants, has been really helpful in the past. And so we wanted to bring it to Toronto. So we were working with these schools, and in fact, we worked with them for the whole year. So by the time we got to the storytelling piece, we'd already been working with them and attending events. We went into the Gender Straight Alliance meetings. We attended Day of Pink assemblies, health and wellness events. We ran some professional development activities for teachers. We attended staff meetings. And then alongside of all of that, we conducted, as you can see, 31 interviews with students and teachers. Our goal with the Beyond Bullying project is to really interrupt the casual conflation of being LGBTQ with risk. You know, if you go into schools right now, they're more and more comfortable inviting conversations about gender and sexuality, but precisely because being gay, being bisexual, being trans puts one at risk for a series of negative outcomes: depression, suicidality, academic underachievement. And we felt that this framing, which is so pervasive, actually shuts out quieter stories about the joys and friendships and disappointments of being trans or being gay or being lesbian. And we wanted to get at those quieter, more ordinary stories. That it's just as important to talk about, you know, what it means to hang out with friends, falling in love, you know, having a crush, being broken up with. Like, these are all also stories of what it means to be LGBTQ in schools. And sometimes the focus on bullying and mental health make it difficult to notice and pay attention to these other ordinary stories. So, as we began mapping out young people's experiences of gender and sexuality in this really particular moment, right? Like, well, let's just hope we never have another moment like this. But after all of this time in lockdown, in the midst of a global pandemic, we began to notice the ways that COVID had shaped every aspect of young people's lives. Frankly, every aspect of my life too. So but there's a way in which, you know, to be 14 during COVID is quite different than to be 50 during COVID. And so we heard these stories of teens' distress and languishing that received a lot of attention in the media, but we also heard other unexpected stories of life under quarantine. Similar to how these stories of risk really dominate discussions of LGBTQ students. There were, oh, see, that was a funny sentence. We were interested in there was really this idea too that LGBTQ young people during quarantine would be living at home with families who may be homophobic or transphobic, that the home would not be the place of safety that the stay-at-home orders presumed it would be, and that LGBTQ youth in particular would be at particular risk during this time. So I'm going to share some data with you. These are from interviews and stories shared by young people. I'm just going to be sharing the transcripts, so the words written out. And I think you'll notice that these stories really capture the pain and loneliness of living in isolation, but also the surprising relief of being with oneself, you know, kind of separated from the pressures of high school. For some students, the relief of not having to deal with quote unquote toxic people made room for other kinds of interactions. So here's Bashida, an 18, and you'll see in the parentheses after Bashida's name that these are the words that she used to describe herself. 18 years old, queer, South Asian. She discussed the ways leaving her camera off during online class made it possible for her to flirt without anyone seeing her blush, which we thought was just a fantastic story. So she says, before going virtual, it's like they can watch me melt so easily, but it's like afterwards I have that screen. So I have like 10 seconds to breathe a little, pull myself together, and then reply. And I feel that's happened like to a lot of people, especially with like a few of my friends. They get very nervous when it comes to flirting, but it's like suddenly they're so good. It's like, no, I know you have like a few minutes to like let yourself calm down and cool down before you get back into it. That idea that online classes could be a space to facilitate flirting, in this case between shy girls, came as a surprise to us, the research team, as did another report from members of one school's Gender and Sexuality Alliance, that certain seemingly random keyboard smashes posted in the class or breakout room chat were coded gay. These keyboard smashes, as well as the use of certain emojis like the peace sign, secretly identified the typer as a member of the LGBTQ community. So they would, if you can imagine, I'm sure for those of you who have had kids in school during online schooling, that you know it's just a screen full of black boxes and names. And for teachers, that could be quite disconcerting. But for students who got the chance to have their cameras off, they found other ways of sort of connecting with each other. And these like random keyboard smashes and using particular emojis in the chat was a way of like telling people a little bit about who you are as a person. So not only did students find these kind of covert ways of bringing their sexual and gender identities into the online class, left on their own in their homes, students use their solitude to ask questions about themselves that previously have felt too risky. So here's Alex, a straight Filipina senior, and she noticed this trend amongst her friends. I feel like a lot of self-discovery is happening during quarantine. One of my friends is questioning her gender right now. I feel like all this time alone has given a lot of people a lot of time to think. Maybe it's too much time to think. I don't know. You'd expect there not to be much change, but there's so much change happening, like in terms of personal growth during this quarantine and how we're coping with things. So you can see here that across the stories and interviews, we discovered students using the space of quarantine to ask themselves difficult questions about identity, how they understood their bodies, their genders, their desires. Bashida claims that amongst her friends, quote, we've all had like this whole awakening where we all explored our sexualities, explored our genders, explored like everything. Like we have this whole spiritual awakening. So the distance and isolation, once characterized by loneliness and struggle, also became a playground for self-reflection. Young people use the time and space to examine their gender and sexuality in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. Here's Estelle, a queer Latinx senior, and she's chronicling the questions she's been asking herself while in quarantine. She writes, actually, she said to me in an interview, one of the few things has been like my gender identity. Like it's one of those things that I pushed aside. I was like, I'll get around to this one day, but not today. And then like the whole quarantine stuff, I'm like, well, I guess I have to solve a couple of issues before I could like, you know, go forward with my life and live, you know, authentically. Knowing one's gender for Estelle is tied to authenticity, while high school, with all its pressure, stands in the way of asking questions about these issues and going forward with her life. Lee, here's another student, a white, queer, and emerging trans student, agrees. They write, over this pandemic, not only at my school, but like generally, so many more kids have come out as something because you're no longer like crushed by the social pressures of cis heteronormative high school. And that means like the assumption that you're both straight and not trans. You sit at home, so you think, and you're like, maybe I like girls, or maybe I like guys, or maybe I'm not a guy, or maybe I'm not a girl. So you're always thinking. And so many people over this pandemic came out as trans, myself included. And it's so good to see people become themselves once they are no longer exposed to like a cesspool of toxicity. Quite a description of high school, isn't it? I don't know, maybe it resonates for you. Many of the students in our study articulated this idea of high school as some form of cesspool of toxicity. The pressure of showing up each day made it difficult for students to take risks. For some, like Sarah, a queer Asian senior, being away from in-person school allowed her to create a new relationship, both to her own self and actually to school. So she says, when the pandemic started and everything, I don't know why, but I stopped caring about what people thought. And I just cut off all my hair. And I was like, you know what? I don't care. And then I joined the Pink Day organizing committee. And that was a committee that organized an anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia big event at the school. So Sarah's account captures something of the complexity of young people's lives under COVID. The freedom to study from home with her camera turned off meant that she could let go of her long hair, which was a normative expectation for girls in the schools we studied. And it allowed her to sign up and participate in an LGBTQ+ school event with less apprehension. The lockdown helped her navigate a new relationship to school as a short-haired lesbian student. Perhaps some of you here today who work with or live with young people also recognize the hopeful explosion of identities young people are claiming for themselves in our COVID times. These identities may be tied to the particular experience of living in quarantine, but regardless, they signal for us really a hopeful creativity. In the midst of this social, political, and health crisis, young people used the resources available to them, Zoom classes, TikTok, long days and nights, social and mainstream media, and they used these resources to question the punishing expectations of high school, what they call cishet high school. We are approaching, as a research team, we're approaching these questions as more than just accounts of what happens for LGBTQ students, the risks they encounter or the resilience they demonstrate. Instead, for us, these stories inspire what we've called in other work, intimate possibilities. And that is the range of desires, relationships, identities, pleasures that one can anticipate, pursue, and claim for oneself and for others. So a real sense of these stories and these experiments as not solid predictions, but as possibilities for the future. And our idea of trying to hold open as many possibilities for young people as possible. At their best, the intimate possibilities that emerge in these stories are expansive, but they're also marked by disappointment as people realize that some identities, desires, and relationships are beyond their own and others' reach. As education researchers trying to understand really the enormous risks, the enormous shifts that COVID has brought to young people's lives, our research suggests that even as we work to support youth as they recover from the losses and the trauma of COVID, we also must remember and hold on to the intimate possibilities that a pandemic surprisingly can bring. And I will end my talk there and invite questions from you. I'll stop my share.
Okay, fantastic. Dr. Gilbert, thank you very much for sharing your research with us. It was really timely, really informative. And now I'm remembering that you spoke earlier at, I believe, one of our York circles about this same research when we were in person. And it's interesting to see how it's evolved to doing research in this online environment. So really wonderful that you've been able to continue that work. So thank you.
Thank you.
So now's the time for questions from our audience. And so just a few instructions for our audience about how to ask questions. I will ask them on your behalf. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. If you are watching live on Facebook, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for the video. Okay, and I'll ask those as they come up. But let me start with one that's very applicable to me in my own life. What advice do you have for parents who want to support their teen kids' new sexual and gender identities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't, I think that my advice would be to mostly just chill out and to one of the things that's been really interesting about this project and talking to young people is that they really, we think as adults that it's like our job to educate young people into tolerance, to kind of help them be good people, to help them learn about all of these different kind of sexual and gender identities. Well, the fact is, young people's they're very sophisticated already. They have very sophisticated ideas about what they want for themselves, about how they feel in their bodies, how they want to navigate the world. And we should see them as actually leaders in this area, as opposed to imagining that we need to give them the language, to kind of make their way in the world. I'm sort of a big believer in like following young people in the paths that they choose for themselves. And this idea of intimate possibilities has been really helpful because I then see myself as a researcher, as an educator, as a parent myself, like trying to just hold open as many possibilities as possible. And I think that that for parents, that can be hard because it means sort of taking a step back and following young people on the paths they may want to take. But I think ultimately, we don't know we don't know yet for ourselves, never mind for our children, what the pandemic will mean over the course of our lives. And so whenever possible, I think it's good to kind of treat young people as experts in their own lives and follow them where they want to go.
Right. And, one thing that I would note as a parent is that they're on a journey, right? As you said, this is a time of exploration. And as a parent, we're following them on their journey and trying to adapt to, their evolving gender identities and, sexual orientation. And, but I really appreciate that advice of following them. And, they seem to certainly have more expertise in themselves than we can possibly have.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'll read from the Q&A. Amanda wrote in and said, not a question, but a comment, that we're back in the office this week for the first time in 2 years. And they're noticing that colleagues are commenting on the same thing about the toxic environment that we didn't miss while we're at home, right? So you were speaking, Dr. Gilbert, about the toxic environment of high school and, the kids, the teens that were reporting on that. Are there ways that your research has shown that anyone, whether it's a workplace or whether it's a high school, how we can reduce the toxicity?
That's a good, if you know the answer to that, I would love to know the answer to that. I would say that, for the young people in the study, it's interesting. On the one hand, the schools are not just one place. So yes, they were, I think, yes, they were toxic in some ways, to use their language, that there were places of suffering, where there places where they felt like they didn't belong, or there were places of struggle. But the same school on the same day also offers spaces of refuge and also offers spaces of support and nurturance. And I think that we want to increase the spaces of support and minimize the spaces of alienation, say, but that all of the students in my study, even if they were doing good things under the pandemic, they missed school terribly. They wanted to go, but they didn't want to stay. They hated online schooling. You know, they really hated it, just almost 100%, probably not 100%, but really did not like it. And they missed their friends terribly. So the same thing, the same, suffering that made this kind of experiment possible. I mean, they did want to go back to school, even if it was toxic, So I think maybe it's the same in the workplace, like on the one hand, there are things about workplaces that can be really challenging personalities and dynamics, but don't we also miss chatting with people and bumping into people in the hallway and getting coffee together? So I think it's similar. High school is just like in some ways a mini version of that.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's talk social media, right? I certainly saw in my own home a real increase. Maybe that's bad parenting on my behalf, but when they were home and as parents, we were trying to work, they certainly turned to social media. What impact do you think that social media, online life has had on how these teens understand their sexual and gender identities?
Mm. Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that when we talk to young people in the school, they really use social media as a resource, that social media offered them a sense of connection and community. They would sometimes come to a story or to an interview with a new idea about who they might be based on a conversation or a video or something they'd seen on social media, like, oh, that really feels like it describes me. So there was a way in which social media offered them almost like a language to describe some of the things that they were feeling. I think, if we think about TikTok in particular, I think was very popular amongst the teens that we worked with. I think that that on the one hand, it really opens up new possibilities for young people and new sites of creativity too, because they're not just consumers, of course, of social media, they're also producers of social media. They're also learning to tell the world who they are through social media. They're not just being sort of like, recruited into some, identity they wouldn't have. They're actually participating. They're actually creating ideas through the connections they're making on social media. And TikTok, I think, on the one hand, offered a really interesting platform for them to do that. But at the same time, like any media, it also kind of set the parameters of what is, what it meant to be pansexual, or what it meant to be what it meant to use they them pronouns, say. So I think it does both things. It kind of creates a space of creativity, but then it also constrains young people and kind of creates new sets of norms that they have to navigate. But they're very savvy, so I think they're okay.
So they're very savvy and they're learning these words, like you said, being pansexual, what that means. And I saw, my kids are pretty young and we're learning that, but because of lockdown, they actually didn't have any opportunity to go out to the field and test out their new learnings or feelings about who they are or who they're becoming. Did you see anything in your research about that, about, exploring, but not being able to put that in practice with other humans face to face?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're thinking about a lot is that we saw a lot more young people raising questions about gender and thinking about their own gender as either cisgendered, so like something like maybe agender, or they have a rich vernacular for this. And the thing that was, and not as many people talking about sexuality. And what was interesting about that, I think, is that while in lockdown, it's hard to have a sexuality without other people, right? You sort of like have a sexuality and it puts you into contact with people you might have a crush on or, want to kiss. But a gender is really, the way we understand it in our world is it's kind of an attribute of a single person. It's something we hold inside of us. As you'll see in Estelle's comment, she talked about it as what makes her feel authentic. And so gender, more than sexuality, became a place where young people in quarantine, in isolation, out of contact with others, were able to kind of begin to think about themselves and their relationship to the norms that govern high school. So I think that that's something that came up for sure.
And it's interesting, on that note, it seems like, teens are really searching for that label, right? And we've tried to be, as adults, create environments that are inclusive, and yet they want to, know the term that defines them even before they're exploring it. Did you see anything about that, or any comments on, I am a something, and then, switching, well, maybe I'm not a something, maybe I'm a this, but that sort of pressure on oneself to label their gender as they're still exploring that. Did you see anything about that?
Well, I think that is, we should see language as itself a playground, and these taking on of terms and labels is really important. It kind of opens up possibilities for the self. So to be able to say about oneself, I am non-binary, for instance, that really, helps create more, I think for young people, helps create a sense of possibility about who they might be in the world. Now, does it mean that they're going to be that way? I think that the language is always shifting. I mean, that word didn't really have purchase 20 years ago. It doesn't mean that people didn't feel that way, but we have a new vocabulary now to describe these feelings around gender and sexuality. And the expansiveness of our vocabulary is in part thanks to young people's creativity. They're offering us new ways of articulating the things we want for ourselves and for others. But I think, as an adult for whom didn't grow up in a time when there were these categories, even to make sense of ourselves, I think it's really important, again, to go back to that following. Like I think it's important to follow young people down the vocabularies they want to use, because these are important to them. We understand how important self-definition is to the development of autonomy. We see it in all other contexts. Why wouldn't we grant young people, the dignity to define themselves and how they want to be, what they want to be called, what names they want to use, what pronouns they want to use. I mean, these are really important moments of asserting a self in a world that can so often feel constraining and oppressive. And I think it's really hopeful that young people, not just young people, but in this study, young people are saying to adults in their lives, listen, call me by this name. This is how I want to be known in the world.
Absolutely. There's so much to learn from the young people in our lives. And sometimes the tricky part is just keeping up. Let's talk a little bit about education and the education system, and how they're teaching, I guess, sex and gender ed in the schools. And I think there were some changes to the curriculum that happened in Ontario over the course of the pandemic. Any comments on that, on education in the classroom, and where that's left kids?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say a couple things. Well, of course, we sort of came out of a controversy around the physical and health education curriculum started in really 2015-ish and sort of resolved itself in 2019, just before the pandemic. I think, we have a curriculum that creates a lot of room for teachers to talk about the things that matter to students in the room. And when I work a lot in different international contexts in Ontario, there's always room for improvement, of course, but there's a lot of space for teachers to do really good work. And they need the resources to do that and the support to do that. But I think that we're on the right track. I will say that the one thing that's sort of interesting about online schooling that really helped, that kind of created some new ways of thinking about gender is that, and I think you might notice at York too, and in our work, is that everyone can name themselves. So, right, like right now it says Jen Gilbert, it doesn't say my full name. I get to decide how I want to be known in the classroom by which name I include in my Zoom box. And then, and many times at York and also in the high schools, people will put their pronouns right beside their name. And that means you don't have that kind of awkward thing where you're having to guess what people's pronouns are or making mistakes and having to apologize. And that for students too, they're able to change their pronouns without like a giant, they just one day will come onto the Zoom into the Zoom classroom and have a different set of pronouns. And I think that in a weird way, the Zoom and online schooling facilitated some of those changes for young people in ways that we probably didn't anticipate.
Absolutely. I've definitely noticed that a lot. And it is a really useful thing. I want to just go to one more comment that's in our chat from Nikita, who said, building on the workplace comment, a lot of times companies like to pretend they're inclusive in order to pat themselves on the back. But the reality is that queer people are still othered at the workplace and have their careers hindered as a result. So this is not necessarily on topic, so we might not want to address it, but as we're talking about, coming together in the workplace and pronouns and, do you have comments on whether sort of how to navigate, putting your pronoun in, on a Zoom screen, if perhaps it's not what people might expect of you, especially if it's changed over time as you get to know yourself? Any thoughts on that in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Nikita, that's a really important point because it happens in schools too, where schools will hang a rainbow flag or say we have this, we're doing all these initiatives, but then the on the ground experience of being a queer person in a school doesn't really seem to shift. And I think, there's this tension, and this really comes up in the stories actually between these sort of broad institutional mandates and changes and programs, which are of course really important. But, as a person navigating a school, navigating a university and being LGBTQ, what are the things that really matter? They ultimately, it also matters, like, do you have friends there? Do people call you by your chosen name? Do you feel like do you feel like you're not a special topic? Like, I love Pride Month, don't get me wrong, I have a great time, but there is something really weird about just seeing rainbows all June and then feeling like the rest of the year you're sort of a special topic. And I think that Nikita is really pointing to something important, which is like, how do we kind of reconcile these broad institutional initiatives that are important, but don't necessarily kind of make the kinds of change in the everyday experiences of LGBTQ people in schools, workplaces, institutions. And I think that deserves our attention too.
Absolutely. I've heard that there might be a move to go from Pride Month to Pride Season to sort of extend, but maybe it's sort of Pride all the time.
Oh yeah,
is where
Pride.
we need to go.
I'm like, I just don't want anyone to sell me anything. That's the thing that, anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but at Pride, it's like all of a sudden my bank is sending me things and I'm like, I don't want to be a market for products.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a sort of a slippery slope that can be difficult to navigate. So we are running out of time, so I want to end with a final question. I'm so grateful for your participation here. But now that the pandemic is receding, what impact do you think that will have on how young people experience their sexual and gender identities?
I don't know, but I will say this, I do some work in another high school. We've been going in person. And prior to the pandemic, they had like a gender sexuality alliance. It's sort of like a club to do anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia work in the school. And prior to the pandemic, they'd meet weekly. It was like 6 members. And now, since the pandemic's been over, they regularly have 40. And so there are people who have used the pandemic to kind of have a different sense of who they are in the world. And I think that's really exciting. What that will mean 5 years from now, I'm not really sure. I'll let you know. But for now, it just feels like a really hopeful, exciting time for young people thinking about sexuality and gender.
I certainly hope so. Okay, so with that, we do have to wrap up. Dr. Gilbert, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your work, and continue doing great work to make the world a more equitable and inclusive place.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks everyone for coming.
Wonderful. So you're welcome to turn off your video, and I'll just close up with some remarks.
Great.
Okay, so for our audience, thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions and comments. As you likely know, we record these sessions, and this will be posted on our YouTube page at youtube.com/YorkU alumni. So feel free to share it with any friends that you want. You can also watch past lectures that you may have missed on that alumni channel. So we have one more poll question for you, and it's going to pop up. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following our discussion? Okay, so it's popped up on your screen, and we appreciate you letting us know. So our next Scholars Hub at Home session is titled "The Latest United Nations Climate Report, Accelerating the Energy Transition." It's taking place on Wednesday, June 22nd, with Dr. Patricia E. Perkins, who's a professor in our Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. You can register for that and learn more about these sessions at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. On behalf of all of us at York University, thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for wanting to learn with us, and thank you for being our community. Happy Pride, and we wish you well.